Hey everybody, it's the little gnome here. I apologize if that intro seemed a little long and excessive, but I felt it was necessary for those of you who recognize it. That's Bela Lugosi's Dead, the intro to it by Bauhaus. Um, I don't own the rights to the music, but I felt it was appropriate just to set the mood for this. Those of you who've seen this video, well, let me rephrase that. Those of you who've seen my other videos recall that musically, my first love was punk rock and always will be. However, related to that first love, there's also other kinds of music that I'm very much into. And if I had to pick another, I guess a second love, if that makes any sense, or something I've loved just as much, or maybe almost as much as punk, it would have to be, well, you guessed it, goth. Gothic rock, goth subculture, etc. So just as much as I'm a lifelong punk rocker, I've been into goth culture for a good portion, almost my entire life as well. It came a little later, but there was, sort of an evolution, if that makes any sense. And so I thought the Bela Lugosi's Dead would be an appropriate mood setter for that. Arguably, that's the song that started it all. The the music and the beginnings of the subculture right there. And the roots are more complicated than that. I'm not going to talk about the history of the genre. And I'm not going to talk about the history of the subculture on its own. I'm going to talk more about my personal history with it. As you know, I've been into punk rock practically my whole life. When I was in diapers, I was spoon-fed a lot of punk rock and loved it. The music, the culture, the attitude, everything about it. But pretty much parallel to that happening, there were a few things that stuck out. One thing, I was always a naturally kind of morbid kid, so I was a morbid little toddler. I was big into horror movies. I loved horror movies, black and white ones, as well as slasher films from the 70s and 80s, monsters, etc. I loved horror comics as well. I was very much into, Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, EC comics in general. So that was sort of my morbid interest. I had a morbid sense of humor. Certain kinds of injuries, actually, if they weren't serious, I found entertaining. I know it sounds really horrible and sadistic, but that's kind of just the truth of it. So I was always kind of a darkly inclined kid, an adult, and while I was growing up with the Sex Pistols and Dead Kennedys and you name it, my uncle would also play a lot of other music for me that came out around the time. Stuff that was relatively new at the time. So along with those bands, he got me to Joy Division, which was Joy Division is considered a post-punk band. We can argue about what genre exactly to classify Joy Division as, but what we can't dispute is the importance of Joy Division to punk and punk culture, as well as the development of Gothic rock. And so I got into Joy Division. I also my uncle also played a lot of Susie and the Banshees for me, Bauhaus, The Cure, early Christian Death. He played all kinds of stuff that came out around the time of punk and new wave. So as a kid, I already had some knowledge of the music. I didn't make the connection between that and goth culture just yet. I didn't know about that. As far as I was concerned, it was just punk, and it was part of punk and new wave and contemporary music in general at the time, and I stayed listening to it. And it wasn't until until it was my early teens that I became aware of a specific culture, music-based culture, known as goth culture, and a genre known as Gothic rock. And I loved the aesthetic, definitely liked the look, and I knew some people who were at least somewhat into it. And the more I studied about it, I found out that a lot of the important bands in the development of goth culture um, were bands that I grew up listening to already. I got into those bands kind of by accident through punk, and so I was like, oh, okay, I already got the music down. I I have the inclination already. I like the aesthetics. I'm going to adopt that. And when I was a teenager, early teens, and throughout high school, I probably embraced the goth label pretty distinctly at that point. I didn't abandon my punk roots, but that's when I went through, I guess, what you can call a goth period, where I identified primarily as goth, and it was a lot of first wave stuff. That's still my preference musically. I'm a second waver by generation. My generation grew up mainly with the '90s goth scene, and that was the scene of my time. But the '90s slash early 2000s. But musically, I always preferred the older bands. So it was Bauhaus, The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, Christian Death with Roz Williams. I liked 45 Grave. I liked Specimen. You name it. I still love these bands to this day. And so when I was my late teens to young adulthood, I took part in a lot of in this scene. I went to shows whenever I could. I went to occasional club nights, etc. And then I kind of took a hiatus from it, but I slowly have kind of reintegrated myself. I'm still in the process of doing that. And now, where does punk fit into all this? Well, I'm still very much a fan of both goth and punk culture and music. And the truth is that goth is an offshoot of punk, a darker, sort of more melodic and more melancholy offshoot of it. But they're still very closely related cultures, and so because of that, I can honestly say that while I'm also very much a punk, I'm goth as well. I'm into both cultures, and I embrace both. Um, Punk is my first love, and goth is sort of the love I found along the way and embraced it. But I embraced it in addition with punk, and if you ask me if I'm a punk rocker, I will gladly say yes. If you ask me if I'm into goth, I will also say yes. And I'm not even going to limit myself to those labels strictly. I like all kinds of stuff. But there you go. Goth, punk, and me have kind of all uh, come together in sort of an open marriage situation where I'm a fan of both, kind of belong to both cultures, and I embrace it all. So there you go. All that kind of there was a natural progression to goth, but instead of abandoning my punk roots, I embraced it in addition to being into punk. So there you go. By the way, I realize this video probably went all over the place. These are not scripted, but hopefully it was somewhat cohesive. Take care. This is the Little Gnome signing off.